Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the CEC17. It's a privilege and a pleasure to see so many of you gathered together for this second international transdisciplinary conference on the many issues that arise when discussing the topic of climate engineering. At the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, the IASS in Potsdam, we've been doing research, assessments, and communication about climate engineering for over 6 years since a scoping workshop that we held in 2011. Our approach to this topic fits in with the general approach of the IASS, working as a platform to bring together all relevant forms of knowledge from science, society, and politics in order to initiate and support transformations towards sustainable development that are grounded in scientific research and help us to face the grand challenges of the Anthropocene. The conference we are opening today builds on the success of the CEC14, the first conference of this kind, which we hosted with our partners 3 years ago. Perhaps these conferences will serve as the start of an ongoing series to discuss issues related to climate engineering in the broader context of climate change. The CEC17 comes at a critical point in time, following on the 2015 Paris Agreement. In the Paris Agreement, as is well known, governments agreed to restrict global mean temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to limit it to below 1.5 degrees. As far as we know, it would still be physically possible to stay within these limits by drastically reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases, especially CO2, as well as other climate-forcing pollutants, such as black carbon and soot. However, this would require reducing emissions to near zero within the next few decades. This seems highly unlikely, given the societal and political inertia that we experience around the world and the resulting current emissions trajectories. Recognizing this has led to often controversial discussions about 2 additional possible approaches to limiting the effects of climate change. First, actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere, and second, directly modifying radiative forcing by either causing more solar radiation to be reflected back to space, or by letting more terrestrial radiation escape through the atmosphere in order to cool the Earth's surface. Together, these have often been called climate engineering techniques. And according to what we have learned from the IPCC assessments, though not impossible, it would be very difficult to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of even staying below 2 degrees Celsius global warming without resorting to at least one, if not both, of these forms of climate engineering. In light of the uncertainties, the potentials, the risks, and the global impacts that would come along with climate engineering, especially in the broader context of the uncertainties and risks of climate change itself, we are in need of an open, transparent, and critical engagement with the questions surrounding research, regulation, and the arguments in favor of and against large-scale technical interventions in the climate system. The debate needs to involve different scientific disciplines, as well as the perspectives from politics and civil society. And this is where the CEC17 steps in. CEC17 is intended to serve as an opportunity for a diverse audience of policymakers, civil society organizations, and members of the public to critically engage with current research and the broader discussions that surround the topic of climate engineering. Further, it is providing a forum to not only present and discuss research results, but also to review the state of discussions around climate engineering and to scope key research questions and challenges for academia and for society. We're also striving to provide a forum for capitalizing on innovative session formats to address the complexity of the issues around the topic of climate engineering, while allowing for open discussions on equal footing as well as providing a platform for networking, collaboration, and exchange across the disciplines, across sectors, particularly academia, policy, and civil society, across countries, continents, and across generations. Over the course of 4 days, we will have a total of 32 sessions and 5 plenary discussions, as well as a public panel discussion in cooperation with the House of World Cultures. Going beyond the CEC14, this time we've encouraged the session conveners to choose innovative and interactive session formats, and we've continued and expanded our efforts to gather representatives from a wide variety of groups, sectors, and communities. We've also focused on including more participants from developing and newly industrialized countries, for which we have partnered with the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative, the SRMGI, which is holding a meeting straddling the CEC17 this week, bringing in many participants from the Global South, in particular from Asia. We have many prominent session conveners, panel discussion participants, and speakers at the conference, some of the leading voices in the field, as well as the presence of active NGOs, in part thanks to the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and active intergovernmental initiatives, in part thanks to our partners, the Carnegie Climate Geoengineering Governance Initiative, or C2G2. And with that, we will now move to the highlights of this opening session. 3 talks giving us a broad set of perspectives on the topic of climate engineering. After that, we'd like to invite you to a reception in the foyer and the upper galleries. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers, Professor Michael Taylor of the University of the West Indies. Professor Taylor, who is also participating in the SRMGI Global Forum, teaches in the Department of Physics at the University of West Indies, Mona, in Jamaica. He also served as the head of the Department of Physics from 2009 to 2016 and is currently the Deputy Dean for the Faculty of Science and Technology. His research interest is in the area of Caribbean climate science, including climate variability and climate change. Professor Taylor has been the director of the Climate Studies Group of MONA, the CSGM, since 2007. The CSGM plays a leading role in coordinating and producing climate research related to the Caribbean region, which, as you all know, has been in the news quite a bit over the last months. Their work has been incorporated into several reports for CARICOM governments, including for reporting purposes to the UNFCCC. Professor Taylor is well published and serves on a number of national and regional climate-related boards and panels. And today, Professor Taylor will give us a talk on climate change and the Caribbean. Important takeaway messages. Professor Taylor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Let me just start by quickly saying thank you very much to the organizers of the conference for the invitation. I really consider it an honor and a privilege. I think my role here today is to set a little context, and it's a context about climate change as viewed through the lens of the Caribbean. As you have heard, the conversation about climate change and the Caribbean has in the past few weeks become significantly louder. And it has become significantly louder because of the passage of not one, but 2 Category 5 hurricanes, those being Irma and Maria, which follow the same path and over some tiny islands of the Eastern Caribbean. It's not really that the conversation on climate change was not taking place before in the Caribbean, but in the wake of the kind of scenes of devastation that were left in the wake of these 2 hurricanes, that conversation has been greatly amplified, clearly making them audible alongside other conversations of immediate and pressing importance for Caribbean existence. There are in fact 2 interesting things about the conversation that is taking place now in the Caribbean about climate change post-Irma and post-Maria. The first interesting thing I would want to say is the range of people participating in the conversation. Usually, a conversation about climate change in the Caribbean would involve very few people, just climate scientists like me, who would be fighting to get the climate change message across. Rather, in this kind of post-Irma and Maria era, the range of people participating has greatly expanded and includes prime ministers and government actors, private sector, financiers, planners, disaster responders, the media, public sector workers, adults, male, female, and just ordinary people like you and me. If there is perhaps then one good thing that we might say has come out of the bad of this, is that climate change has gotten the sustained attention of many people, and that is noteworthy. But perhaps the second noteworthy thing is not just the range of people talking about climate change now, but it's actually the range of topics that are being discussed. And it's not just limited to the storms and what was unusual about them, their ferocity, the ability to maintain their intensity for days on end. Rather, that conversation has now been extended to look on past climates, future climates, attribution, losses, damage, recovery, restitution, adaptation, prevention, resilience, survival. In other words, the range of the discussion is notable because it now takes the discussion on climate change in the Caribbean from being a science issue to being a human issue. I think then the challenge then for us in the Caribbean is to see what are the key messages that we can distill from the range of voices and the range of themes, so that after this hurricane season has passed, can we draw them as key lessons? I want to suggest that there are in fact three simple takeaway messages, which I think that the Caribbean and the wider global community can take away in this post-Irma and Maria conversation. So in other words, when climate change is viewed through the lens of the Caribbean and considered in the context of the Caribbean reality, perhaps these are the three messages that are coming home, three takeaway messages. What quickly then are these three takeaway messages? Well, takeaway message one is this: simply take notice, our climate is changing. Takeaway message one, take notice, our climate is changing. So one of the common threads of the conversation is the notion that our climate is just absolutely not behaving as it is used to. In the Caribbean, the historical climate records would support this message. So, though we are used to being hot, if we look on the number of really, really hot days in a year, as signified by the diagram in the top, you can see that it's increasing. And same for the number of really, really hot nights in the year. And so the impression is, of course, that we're having earlier summers and longer summers. And it's not just that it's getting hotter, but if we look on rainfall records, the total rainfall may not suggest an overall drying or wetting, but the character of rain seems to be changing. And so what we get is an increase in both the consecutive dry days and intense rainfall events. Put it another way, so there are longer dry spells, but when it rains, it rains. Sea levels are also rising at roughly the global average and taking with them valuable shorelines and beautiful beaches, which are the important elements to the tourism product of the region. And then there seemingly has been an increase in extreme events, including prolonged droughts and the tropical storms and intense hurricane activity, though climate change may not be the only thing playing a role in the latter instance. But I think you get the idea that I'm trying to bring across. In tandem, there seems to be a strong case that there is something unfamiliar about the climate today in the Caribbean. I know the question that's going through your mind. It is simply this: so what? So what if there is something unfamiliar about the climate today in the Caribbean? Well, in the context of the Caribbean, the problem with the unfamiliar is it is really that daily existence in the Caribbean is very sensitive to climate variations, and as such is strongly dependent on familiar patterns of climate. It's fair to say that life in the Caribbean really revolves around climate. So on the one hand, daily life is structured to take advantage of these mean climate conditions and ambient climate conditions. So life by design or by default occurs outdoor. But if life occurs outdoors, then this makes the average Caribbean person, whether they be a tourist, tourism worker, a Caribbean farmer, a sportsman, security personnel, or even a student, among the emerging class of climate vulnerable in the newer, unfamiliar, and an unexpected environment of hotter temperatures. On the other hand, this is not the only reason for climate sensitivity, because the economies of the region are also premised on industries and sectors, example, tourism and agriculture, which are extremely sensitive to climate variation. And so too are the quality of life indicators, such as water availability and health and well-being. So in a good climate year, which follows mean expected patterns and pulls no surprises, there's favorable economic growth and noticeable improvements in standards of living. And when the weather is bad, even up until now, there has been a familiarity with how bad it can become, and that is accounted for. For, as predominantly island states, most of our infrastructure and population centers are inevitably sited only a few kilometers from the shore, making them highly vulnerable to extreme weather events. Up until now, even the newer regional infrastructures could withstand the ravages of hurricanes and tropical storms, as we have seen from Irma and Maria. No more. I think the point I'm trying to make is this, that as the climate change seems to be quickly heralding in an era characterized by unfamiliarity, the strong sensitivity of the region to climate, and this sensitivity in part defines Caribbean life, is quickly being transformed into a vulnerability. If we allow this to go unnoticed, it has the clear potential to significantly erode Caribbean life, the way of life, the standard of life, and the quality of life. It's for this reason, then, I think, that the very first simple takeaway message is this. Take notice. Our climate is changing, and with that change comes the challenge of the unfamiliar. But I suggested there were 3 takeaway messages. If the first takeaway message is take notice, our climate is changing, and with that comes the challenge of the unfamiliar, then the second takeaway message hinges on the scientific projection for the Caribbean, and I sum it up with this very simple diagram. If you take models and plus scenarios, you get future projections. When you look on the future projections for the Caribbean, you get the second takeaway message, and it is this. Take account of the fact that our climate will continue to change. And the future Caribbean climate will look a lot different than it will look today. So very quickly, if we, on unabated greenhouse gas emissions, look at what the Caribbean will look like at the end of the century, it may look something like this. In the first instance, a very hot Caribbean, irrespective of scenario, whether the better case scenario at the bottom or the worst case at the top, will be even hotter. Probably a further 2 or 3 degrees over the 1 degree warming already seen, with up to 98% of all days hot by current standards. The rainfall will continue to be variable, but it will vary about a lower threshold, as rainfall amounts will decrease by up to 40%, and during the months when rainfall is normally expected, posing a significant challenge to already water-stressed Caribbean territories. Sea levels will continue to rise, probably by a further 1 to 2 meters, removing parts of some of our islands, and far exceeding the rise already recorded. And frighteningly, the frequency of tropical Atlantic hurricanes of the highest intensities will increase, or are projected to increase, though not necessarily the frequency of hurricanes overall. I think cumulatively the science of projection suggests that the region's climate will be so significantly altered it will look nothing like anything we are currently used to, as it will be outside the bounds of our lived experience to date. What am I saying? It will not just be unfamiliar, but it is likely to be unprecedented. And I know the question that I think is going through your mind, that it is simply, so what? So what if it should be unprecedented? Well, in the context of the Caribbean, unprecedented climate will likely lead to unprecedented impacts, which have the potential now not just to erode the Caribbean way of life, but rather to set back or defer Caribbean development dreams. With every facet of Caribbean life being so climate sensitive, every facet will be impacted in significant ways. And perhaps this is the major lesson from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Though the stocktaking is hardly complete, at least for Barbuda, Dominica, Puerto Rico, the setback to their economies will likely be measured in years, as the initial estimates for rebuilding are of staggering proportions. Perhaps even more heartbreaking, however, is the loss of those things that are economically unquantifiable. The drastic reductions in the standards of living, especially for the most vulnerable. The loss of irreplaceable culture and cultural assets. The mental anguish and loss of lives. The loss of biodiversity. And the undermining of achievements already made in the pursuit of sustainable development. Does this portend the future challenge that unprecedented climate change represents for the Caribbean region? Let me put it another way. For the Caribbean not to account for future climate change would be making a mockery of its commitments to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, because it would make them unattainable, as climate would keep pushing the goalpost further and further away. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that with climate change comes a potential heralding in of an era characterized not just by the unfamiliar, but by the unprecedented. For the Caribbean, the need to account for the coming climate challenge becomes even more acute if the rate at which the era of the unprecedented is being ushered in outstrips the rate at which the region can prepare for its onset. In that kind of context, here is the dilemma we face: figuring out how to contend with the unfamiliar now while preparing for the unprecedented that is to come. I think then you can see why my second takeaway message about climate change, when viewed through the lens of the Caribbean or considered in the context of the Caribbean reality, is simply this: take account of the fact that our climate will continue to change, for with it comes the challenge of the unprecedented. So finally, 3 simple takeaway messages. If the first is take notice our climate is changing, and we must notice because of the challenge of the unfamiliar. And if the second is take account of the fact that our climate will continue to change, because with it comes the challenge of the unprecedented, then the third is embarrassingly simple. That third takeaway message must be: take action. Our climate demands change. You can see where I get this. For the unfamiliar demands that we change our current attitude to climate, we must take notice of what climate is already doing. While the potential for the unprecedented demands we change our approach to development planning, we must take account for what climate can do. The third message then is that, simply this, that our climate conversation has to move beyond acknowledgement and consideration to action, an action which is characterized by urgency. The need is for action, and for action now. In the Caribbean, I think that action that needs to be taken becomes clearer with each climate change manifestation. So we know in the Caribbean that there is need to explore mitigation, options to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations, including the use of renewable energy, targeting preservation of forests, and tackling waste. These all represent win-win considerations for the Caribbean anyway, even if there were no climate change. We know in the Caribbean that we must implement appropriate adaptation strategies. And these adaptation strategies are aimed at reducing the climate sensitivity of critical sectors and areas of life. In particular, we have to target water availability in the future of less rainfall, sustainable agriculture in a harsher physical environment, tourism which benefits from but is not entirely dependent on natural assets, health which is more resistant to climate variation, and coastal infrastructure which can withstand unprecedented weather extremes. There is also the immediate need in the Caribbean, we know, for enhanced public education about climate change and its impact, which targets knowledge sharing and behavioral change, and which uses all possible fora to reach all possible ages. In tandem, all 3 actions will lead to a climate-resilient Caribbean. Yet, even if the region had all the necessary resources to take all these actions, in the end, its future viability will be to a large extent premised on collective global action, which drastically and quickly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, thereby delaying the worst impacts of climate change. It is here then that the challenge of urgency comes into play. It is for this reason that I think you know that the Caribbean and other small island developing states have argued and lobbied for 1.5 degrees to be the limit of mean global warming in the current century. And they use a very catchy slogan, 1.5 to stay alive. There is need to act now if it is to be at all achievable. Of course, whatever global action is taken in this regard must bear in mind the inequities of the past that have gotten us to this point. And so it must be guided by some principles, including but not limited to being impactful but sensitive, transformative but just, acknowledging both responsibility and responsibilities, being inclusive and not prescriptive, being timely and not imposed. And it is within these boundaries that I suggest that the discussions of this conference must take place. When climate change is, however, considered in the context of the Caribbean reality and viewed through the lens of the Caribbean, I think you can see why the third takeaway message is simple, and it is, take action. Our climate demands change. We must respond to the challenge posed with urgency. So in closing, I note that what is driving the conversation about climate change in the Caribbean now, for Irma and Maria have passed a couple of weeks, is a regional sense of unease, because in truth we still have 2 months to go in the current hurricane season, and therefore the capacity exists for this to be an even more record-breaking season than has already been. When climate change is viewed through the lens of the Caribbean, and in the context of the Caribbean reality, the lessons seem pretty clear. For the Caribbean, those lessons suggest that the unfamiliar is already a challenge. The unprecedented will likely be too much of a challenge. And so global urgency in purpose and action that goes even beyond the Paris Agreement is our only real hope. I leave you then with the 3 takeaway messages about climate change, which perhaps you can take away from the Caribbean's contemplation of this issue, which I think have relevance for everybody. Take notice, our climate is changing. It comes with the challenge of the unfamiliar. Take account, our climate will continue to change. It comes with the challenge of the unprecedented. And take action. Our climate demands change. This is the challenge of urgency. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that powerful perspective, for that great scientific introduction, for the personalized perspective from a region which is really facing the massive challenges of climate change and reminds us of why the topic of climate engineering has continued to garner interest and why it's so important that we carry out critical discussions, global discussions that include all voices, the voices of sciences and the voices of regions that are so threatened by this issue. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who hardly needs any introduction, actually, to most of those who have dealt with the topic of climate engineering, namely Oliver Morton from The Economist. But I would like to introduce Oliver and give you a little bit of a perspective into his breadth and into the fortune that we have that he's delved so deeply and stuck with us so long with this topic of climate engineering. Oliver writes about scientific and technological changes and their effects. He concentrates particularly on the understanding and imagining of planetary processes. And boy, can I tell you about imagining. I got a little sneak preview of his talk already. He's a senior editor at The Economist, responsible for the magazine's briefings and essays. He was previously chief news and features editor at Nature and the editor of Wired UK, and has contributed to a wide range of other publications. He writes on subjects from quantum physics to synthetic biology to movie making. His articles have been anthologized and won awards. He's the author of 3 books, Mapping Mars, The Science, Imagination, and Birth of a World in 2002, which was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award. Then he wrote Eating the Sun, How Plants Power the Planet in 2007, a book of the year in The Spectator and the Times Literary Supplement. And then finally, he wrote what many of us are familiar with, The Planet Remade, How Geoengineering Could Change the World in 2015, which was longlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize and shortlisted for the Royal Society Book Prize. In the Sunday Times, Brian Appleyard described it as ambitious, enthralling, and slightly strange. He's an honorary professor in the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy, which sort of covers all of his various interests, at UCL, University College of London, and has a degree in the History and Philosophy of Science from Cambridge University. And most important of all, the asteroid 10716 Oliver Morton is named in his honor. Oliver is going to talk to us tonight about re-engineering and reimagining the Earth. Oliver.
Hi, thank you all very much for that warm welcome. Thank you very much, Mark. To talk about climate geoengineering is to talk about humans and nature, and it is thus to join in a conversation that has been going on for centuries and will continue, if we are spared, for centuries to come. That conversation takes place in everyday life. It takes place in farms and in forests. It takes place in books and lecture halls. It takes place in churches and temples, and, though not as much as it should, in parliaments. It takes place in science fiction and in the world of art. It takes place in curves, in lines, in landscapes. Here is part of that conversation, The Oxbow by Thomas Cole, arguably the first masterpiece by undoubtedly America's first great landscape artist. On the left, you have wild nature, a windswept wilderness dominated by a signifier of nature's power that you find throughout Cole's work, the lightning-blasted tree. On the right, the almost domesticity of Arcadia, a landscape that is conspicuously cared for. To many American settlers, the story of their progress was the story of this second landscape replacing the first, of the continent as a whole, specifically including its wild, un-European climate, being tamed by the spread of yeoman farmers and their transformation of the land. The presence of civilization in and of itself was an act of geoengineering. And yet Cole's picture is not as simple as that. There is humanity in the wilderness, the painter himself, a parasol cheekily piercing the painting's great divide, what might be an easel or might be a cross. And there is nature and its power for change in Acadia. The course of the river meandering through the lowlands will change and change again. The lines and curves of history are not a simple matter of one half of the painting coming to dominate the other. When the organisers of CEC17 were kind enough to ask me to speak 3 years ago at CEC14, I read a little bit of what was then a work in process and is now my book, The Planet Remade. The passage was about the great black bowl of the stratosphere's sky, the bright curved rim of the Earth, and the straight dark line of the wing. A human intervention that made imagining this strange part of the world possible, and thus also had to be a part of that imagining. You can't paint the wilderness without going into it, parasol and all. My purpose in talking about the stratosphere was, of course, to talk about aerosols and albedo modification, about deliberately creating a planetary parasol. Here is the veil of such particles thrown up by Mount Pinatubo. In this painting of Cotopaxi, Frederick Church, Thomas Cole's greatest pupil, captures the sublime natural power of such parasol unfurling events, and seems, to me, to beautifully evoke the poetry and peril of an occluded sun. In talking not just about the stratosphere, but about the wings that let you experience it, I was trying, in part, to add a touch of the technological sublime, and in so doing, to add a human element. You can't, I said, imagine the world changed without imagining the means of that change. You can't imagine the means without the motive. One of the burdens of my book was to argue that to see the motive for climate geoengineering by wings or any other means as control was both unrealistic and dangerous. A better motive, I suggested, is care. So let us look at the ideas of a planet under constant care. The Scientific Adventures of Baron Munchausen is a novel of sorts by Hugo Gernsback, who was in essence the inventor of science fiction in its 20th century American form. A radio enthusiast in Massachusetts picks up messages from beyond the Earth. They turn out to come from Baron Munchausen, who is traveling first to the moon and then to Mars and wants to describe the wonders that he sees. Among the extraordinary things that Munchausen encounters on Mars are vast cubes of wire mesh hung above the surface, charged with unearthly currents. They glow with a startling purple light. These machines, which are not visible, alas, in the Martian vista I show you here, which is just one of those run-of-the-mill pictures that gets sent back across millions of kilometers by wandering robots these days, turns out to be the Martians' air-purifying plants. They scrub carbon dioxide from the planet's atmosphere and turn it into a precipitate which fills what the Baron takes to be the Martians' special agricultural requirements. The Martians care for their planet not piecemeal, like farmers taming the wilderness, but with a technological network that covers the whole globe. It seems awe-inspiring and deeply alien, but as the Baron asks his interlocutor in the last line of the book, how long will it be with your coal-burning machinery till the Earth's atmosphere will need cleaning plants? Gernsback's Scientific Adventures, published in magazine form in 1915, did not make much of an impact, and it has not aged gracefully, and in truth it wasn't very good in the first place. It does not have the grandeur of Percival Lowell's books on Mars as the abode of life, books which introduced the idea of Martians banding together to respond to their homeworld's desertification through the creation of great linear canals. I came across Gernsback's book by chance, browsing in a Minneapolis bookshop called, entirely uncoincidentally, Uncle Hugo's. Those last lines, though, jumped out at me. They still do. How long will it be with your coal-burning machinery till the Earth's atmosphere will need cleaning parts? In Paris, 100 years later, this forgotten bit of pulp fiction got its answer. A large body of technical opinion now sees, or hopes to see, or pretends to see, the atmospheric cleaning plants starting to come online in about 40 years or so. The vast body of popular opinion, meanwhile, has not yet caught on that these things are under serious consideration at all, or what their implementation might entail. They will not be grids of wire glowing in an unearthly purple, or necessarily lines across landscapes like this one I'm showing you. They could be vast plantations feeding power stations, or interventions into ocean ecosystems, and they could, then as now, remain stuck in our imaginations. When Gernsback was writing his tall tales, the carbon dioxide level on Earth was 300 parts per million, and the global mean surface temperature, according to Hadkut 4, was about 1 degree less than it was last year. We know these numbers. We need to appreciate them. The century that separates us from Gernsback, the 5th century of the transatlantic economy, the 3rd century of the capitalist economy, the 2nd century of industrial revolution, the 1st century of globalized fossil fuel extraction, was almost also the 1st century in human history that was geophysically significant in and of itself. In situating our discussions, it is vital to remember that this change was not a surprise. It was clearly seen by the sort of people that Gernsback read, people like Svante Arrhenius, who calculated the greenhouse effect of rising carbon dioxide levels, and Alfred Lotka, who in 1925 provided what I still see as a remarkable encapsulation of humanity's new relationship with nature in the context of geological time and planetary scale. The process of fossilization, Lotka wrote, has furnished the occasion for a phenomenon which, judged in a cosmic perspective, represents a purely ephemeral flare, but which to us, the human race, is of altogether transcendent importance. Biologically, we are changing radically the complexion of our share in the carbon cycle by throwing into the atmosphere from coal fires and metallurgical furnaces 10 times as much carbon dioxide as the natural processes of breathing. These human agencies alone would, in the course of about 500 years, double the amount of carbon dioxide in the entire atmosphere. The time scale is wrong. The insight and its depth is correct. When people look back on our conversations here in 100 years, will they say the same thing? Gernsback's ideas about the Martians engineering their carbon cycle with what we would now call direct air capture were, I think, unique. But their thrust was not. The idea that there were Martians, that they were advanced beyond the inhabitants of the Earth, and that they were involved in engineering their planetary environment was widely speculated upon. Not all scientists believed in the Martians, nor was to talk as if you believed in the Martians necessarily to take them seriously. They were, in large part, a rhetorical device. But though belief was not universal and came in various gradations, no one, I think, argued that, if there were Martians, they could not possibly be trying to care for their planet's failing climate through a global network of canals. It seemed a reasonable thing. After all, had not the Earth been networked itself by telegraphs and by steam? Though by Gernsback's time it was electricity which illuminated the imagination, he and everyone else knew that the great mover of progress had been steam, that it was steam which had ushered in, no, pounded in, driven home modernity. As John Stuart Mill wrote in his review of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the way in which the railroad allowed everyone to move changed everything, including government. Society, history was given direction. The new and the next, always a destination. The past, always left behind. As Turner showed in this masterpiece, Rain, Steam and Speed, the arrow of history now cut through the landscape, threatened to burst from the canvas. In the coming age, there was no longer to be a sinuous line between the wilderness and the cultivated. Steam's motive and emotive power was at one with the elements, a technology capable of competing with nature in the production of the sublime. Thermodynamics, the science of steam engines, was the science of the age, explaining the world and the cosmos to Arrhenius, to Lotka and their like. Steam allowed humans to be, if not like gods, then at least like the titans who fought with them. Listen to Lord Byron writing the decade before Turner painted this picture. Where shall we set bounds to the power of steam? Who shall say, thus far shalt thou go and no farther? Might not the fable of Prometheus and his stealing the fire be but traditions of steam and its machinery? Who knows whether, when a comet shall approach this globe to destroy it, men will not tear rocks from their foundations by means of steam, and hurl mountains as the giants are said to have done against the flaming mass. And then we shall have traditions of titans again, and of wars with heaven. And there we have it, the titanic idea of Prometheus, reimagined from the distant past to the present, the great, doomed, well-intentioned, careless gift giver. Here he is a century later. Oh, no, he's not. There's a slide missing there. If you saw that slide, you would be able to see a picture of Prometheus on the cover of one of Gernsback's science fiction magazines, a story about bringing down the fire of atomic energy to the surface of the Earth in a good way. Because to romantics like Byron and Shelley, and to technophiles like Gernsback, Prometheus was a hero. Yet others, saw things as more complex. The endeavors of the Prometheus of modern times, wrote Immanuel Kant, are proofs of the boldness of man, allied with a capacity which stands in a very modest relationship to that boldness. Ultimately, they lead him to the humbling reminder, which is where he ought properly to start, that he is never anything more than a human being. It is easy and true to say that that humbling reminder is something which all of us who think about climate geoengineering as a possible form of planetary care must take to our hearts. It is harder to say how, so reminded, to move forward. Perhaps it helps to know that the Prometheus Kant was writing of was a specific person. It was Benjamin Franklin, who sought with his lightning rods, here on his house in Philadelphia, to disarm the thunder by pulling fire from the sky. This technology was deeply controversial. At one level, the debate was a technical one about whether lightning rods should be knobly-ended or pointy-ended, about whether they reduced risks or, rather crucially, increased them. At another level, it was anything but technical. It was a debate about how and when, and on whose account, humans might challenge nature and the natural order, and if they did so, what else they might challenge too. Shelley's Prometheus is a political, not a technological hero. The Promethean Franklin took part in the sundering of an old kingdom and the creation of a new republic. Today, lightning conductors are for the most part a closed story. Pointiness and knobbliness are no longer issues. The risk calculus is well understood. Concerns about lightning and buildings have largely been taken care of. Lightning can now be played with, even aestheticized. Here is Walter Lamaria's lightning field, where lines in the landscape, strangely reminiscent to me at least of the grids in the Martian landscape that Gernsback imagined, draw arcs of fire from the sky for no reason other than that they can. As lightning conductors then, geoengineering today, a Promethean science in exactly the way that the historian Simon Schaffer, my teacher, my mentor and my friend, defines the term in an essay on the lightning conductor controversies. Promethean science, Schaffer teaches us, is an experimental enterprise that mixes a vaulting ambition to safeguard humanity with the troubling hazards of following this science's recipes. Some may take this in a rather positive way. What was Promethean becomes, in time, pragmatic. Technical controversies are resolved. Great questions are set aside. Maybe in 100 years, that is how all this will look. But I want to focus on something that divides the two subjects and their time periods. That climate geoengineering is prey to hubris, there is no doubt. But what of Franklin-like radicalism? Concerns about geoengineering have an interesting divergence. In terms of the Earth system, the risks are deemed catastrophic, none more so, perhaps, than the much-vaunted termination shock in which the stratospheric parasols are closed and the full weight of warming dropped down from the heavens. It is, literally, an apocalyptic vision, in that the literal meaning of apocalypse is an unveiling. It reveals the truth behind. Take away the veil and see what happens. This torn apocalypse by Gerhard Richter, Rorate coeli de super, drop down, ye heavens, seems apposite. And yet, politically, the critique of climate geoengineering is almost the reverse. Not that it brings sudden change, but that it forestalls it, that its moral hazard hampers the drive to decarbonize, that it allows the world to continue as it is, even as the underlying reality shifts, that it buys doomed capitalism at least a simulacrum of borrowed time. That it is, in a word we do not hear very much, but which seems very apt, catacalyptic, It draws up the veil, covering the sun, covering the need for change, covering the gulf humans are driving between themselves and some idea of nature. This, it seems to me, is a much deeper issue than the presumed apocalypse of termination. Let me put the sky back in its place. I do not know what a radical geoengineering looks like. I do not know if one is needed. But I worry that in our discussions, too often we treat politics as a fixed, a pro or anti-geoengineering context, while thinking of making the Earth system increasingly labile. We do not stop to think of how geoengineering, as part of a wider response to climate change, might be some part of something more broadly transformative, of how it could help bring about a caring world which we might, in time, trust with such Promethean power. Let me return to the beginning and find you two contemporary images that throw Cole's oxbow forward, some new lines in the landscape. Michael Light's magnificent picture of the Snake River again draws the line between humanity, now suburban, not Arcadian, and nature, but it does so with far greater draming, far more foreboding. There are no curves here. The sky is gone. The wilderness is below, and it is hungry. There are, it seems, no compromises to be drawn, and yet the landscape persists. And then there is Andreas Gursky's Rhine 2. Here, all hint of conflict has been purged. Nature is pure, untrammeled. Sky, land, and water are independent blocks of being. Progress is gone. The path does not rush into or out of the picture, but crosses it as evenly as every other line. All other marks of humanity are expunged. Except humanity is everywhere in this highly processed picture, in the editing, in the removal, in the covering up. Catacalypse now. Gursky's humanity frames it all, providing from outside the picture a unique vision of stasis without claustrophobia, of a world beyond both energy and entropy. I have rarely seen a photograph more beautiful. When first I saw it in London's Tate Modern, I could only stop and stare, but it needs a contrast. Here is Olafur Eliasson's Weather Project, a vast installation actually created for the halls of Tate Modern. A hall where fossil fires powered huge turbines is illuminated by an artificial sun. The palette could not be further from Gursky's. All lines are straight or closed, nothing natural persists, and yet it is inhabited, appreciated from within by those figures on the floor with a surprising joy. It is a work that in its time in the gallery people came to care for. These two artworks may be fundamentally opposed, but maybe their closed and open visions are the same. I do not know. I want to think and to ask and to learn. To talk about climate geoengineering is to talk about humans and nature. To join that conversation is not just to take a stand within it. It is to listen to as much of it as you can. It is to listen to the now and to listen to the past, to feel for the lines and curves along which the conversation will carry on into the future, to respond to it and to be willing to play a role. It is to be aware, as Kant was, of our modest capacities, but it is also, when called upon, to be bold. I hope we have a magnificent conference.
Well, thank you so much, Oliver. You've not let us down with that enticing lecture, so tremendously imaginative and still very well-founded and well-grounded in history and philosophy. I think that sets us off to a lot of the issues that we have to think about that go far beyond the science and the politics of climate engineering into the vast realm of all of the social issues that are involved with it. You'll notice that though our conference is called Critical Global Discussions, tonight we're not taking a Q&A after the talks. However, I'd like to remind you again of the reception that we will have afterwards and your opportunity to pounce on our speakers and give them the chance to give you their thoughts in detail about your many questions and inputs to their talks. So, and with that, I would like to introduce our last speaker, who is Dr. Michelle Giles McDonough. Michelle brings us back to the Caribbean in a sense, coming from Jamaica, but she is now the director of the Sustainable Development Unit of the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations in New York. And we're really privileged to have the opportunity to have Michelle give us yet another of the perspectives on the issue of climate engineering. Throughout her career, Michelle has practiced privately as a lawyer, served as an advisor to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, and has deep development experience within the UNDP, including as chief of UNDP's sub-regional facility for the Caribbean, the UN Resident Coordinator for Barbados, and the OECS Resident Coordinator for Malaysia, Singapore, and the Brunei Darussalam, and was recently appointed as Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Regional Director Designate for Asia and the Pacific. And when I met her and was talking with her, I was trying to pick out where she was from her accent. And I said, "You are very hard to pick out from." And she said, "Yes, she's from lots of different places." She's currently the director of the Sustainable Development Unit in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. Michelle holds a degree in law from Columbia University School of Law with honors in international and foreign law, a master's in public administration from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and also a diploma in executive education from the Morton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So you can see with that kind of a background why we've picked her out to give us a perspective here this evening. She received her undergraduate degree at the Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, and tonight she's going to be telling us about her perspectives on the international context for the geoengineering debate. Michelle.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction, and good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to thank the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies for inviting me to this conference on climate engineering. It gives me a great pleasure to be a part of this very important meeting and actually to have benefited from the presentations of our two previous keynote speakers, Michael and Oliver. I took away from those two things that I will hope to try to pull together now in this final brief remarks, and that is the need for us to act now to deal with the unprecedented, and the role of science and technology in the solutions, and the complexity of the discussions that we need to have as we try to cross those frontiers and try to go through, pierce the boundaries from where we are now and look at what it is we need to deal with going forward. You are the thematic experts, and so it is not my intention to provide you with views on the specific innovative technologies. What I would like to try to do is to share with you some thoughts on the global context in which your discussions about climate engineering are taking place, and the critical role that you all play in advancing innovative new technologies and solutions to address climate change and the other pressing development challenges and concerns for our planet and people, particularly the most vulnerable among us. As you're aware, the international community came together in September 2015, and it adopted a truly remarkable framework to transform our world. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, apply to all countries. They're a plan of action for the next 13 years to significantly shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path that leaves no one behind. The scale of the transformation required by the 2030 Agenda and the 17 goals is far more significant than anything ever envisioned for the global community. And it will require that we design and implement solutions to address the challenges ahead. Goals 3, 4, and 9, relating to health, quality education and industry, innovation and infrastructure, underline the need to strengthen the domestic research, technological and industrial capacity to produce new and improved sustainable and competitive solutions for healthcare services, agriculture, infrastructure development, and for tackling climate change. Science and technology innovation will help accelerate progress and also, we hope, give us the wherewithal to do so within our planetary boundaries. We will need to do this, as we're trying to do here over the next couple of days, by creating the necessary partnerships across business, the scientific community, and civil society and governments to meet the goals. While the SDGs are not legally binding, governments are already taking ownership and establishing their pathways to achieve them. However, as much as we're beginning to see the countries rallying around the agenda, we also continue to punish the planet with our actions. More than 2 billion people confront water stress, and 9 out of 10 city dwellers are breathing polluted air. The devastation caused by the natural disasters across the globe, which I think Michael really brought front and center as he went through the experience that we're currently having in the Caribbean and in the United States. They continue to cost us billions in restoring critical infrastructure. They're displacing millions, and they're wiping away decades of development dividends and gains. Strengthening the resilience of institutions, of communities, individuals, and our environment remains key to ensuring that sustainable development is achieved. Reducing disaster and climate risks in particular, and in particular bending the emissions curve by 2020, must be a top priority. The implementation of the Paris Agreement is therefore central to the success of the 2030 Agenda. The Paris Agreement, like the 2030 Agenda, was also signed by almost every country in the world. And after it was adopted, the agreement entered into force in less than a year, record speed in the international world. Testimony to the urgency of the action that is needed. To date, more than 160 parties have ratified it, and the numbers are growing monthly. And so we come back to the point, I think one of the takeaway messages from Michael, the urgency is recognized. And I think this conference over the next couple of days, we're beginning to have this conversation about what is the action we need to take to ensure that we can deal with the unprecedented. The Paris Agreement sets an ambitious goal to keep average increase of global temperature well below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5, and allowed every signatory to decide how they would contribute to achieve this goal and what would be the specific actions that they would undertake to reach the objective, based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It doesn't impose specific adaptation or mitigation actions, nor does it take any position on whether any specific technology should or should not be deployed. That is where this community has a significant role to play. Countries need to call on the best available science in order to decide on which options they undertake to combat climate change. And we must make access to the requisite technologies equitable to make progress. In the international sphere, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change acts as the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. It was established to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments concerning climate change, its implications and risks, as well as to put forward adaptation and mitigation strategies. Its assessments of climate change enable policymakers at all levels of government to take sound, evidence-based decisions. One of the decisions that countries will be taking in the future is whether to deploy geoengineering technologies as a mitigation measure to reduce the concentration of anthropogenic greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the question about whether and how to deploy these types of technologies is becoming more and more widely interrogated. Without referring to any specific technology, IPCC's last assessment report in 2014 recognizes that mitigation measures intersect with other societal goals, creating the possibility of co-benefits or adverse side effects. According to the report, these intersections, if well managed, can strengthen the basis for undertaking climate action. In 2018, the IPCC will issue a special report on pathways to achieve the objective of limiting the global increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees. The report will need to consider whether the contribution of technologies such as carbon dioxide removal will be needed to achieve that 1.5 degree path. Science will provide policy-relevant information on these issues, but decisions on whether or not such technologies should be used need to be taken by societies as a whole, within normal decision-making processes at subnational, national, and international levels. Some UN organizations and intergovernmental processes have started to address these issues. The parties to the Convention of Biological Diversity noted in December 2016 that the application of the precautionary approach, the customary international law, the general obligations of states with regard to activities within their jurisdictions, and requirements relating to environmental impact assessment may be relevant for geoengineering activities, but still form an incomplete basis for global regulation. This implies that we would have to consider what more will be needed, and you're the community that can help us answer some of those critical questions. The parties to the CBD have also called for more transdisciplinary research and sharing of knowledge to better understand the impacts of climate-related geoengineering on biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, socioeconomic, cultural, and ethical issues, and regulatory options. This will help us to understand what type of rules and agreements these technologies would need to be made operational, what type of governance rules they would require, and eventually whether an international regulatory framework can be put in place in a way that allows the deployment of new technologies while at the same time protecting from its anticipated risks. The United Nations Secretary General very recently reminded us that innovation is something that we must address. In his speech at the opening of the 72nd session of the General Assembly, he pointed out that technology will continue to be at the heart of shared progress, while noting that innovation, as essential as it is to humanity, can also have unforeseen consequences. Science and technology drive progress. They improve health and living standards, boost economic growth, increase productivity, and improve job conditions. But innovation can also have unplanned effects, particularly shifting the needs of the job markets and making some jobs redundant. They widen gaps in inequality along multiple dimensions. They challenge our ethical frameworks, for example. And so it is our duty, and yours as scientists, to investigate and assess all the possible consequences of the technologies being proposed, and to provide, working with other disciplines, the most accurate assessment not only of the specific benefits of the technology being proposed, but also of its potential risks and impacts. While the various geoengineering technologies and their potential role to reduce the climate risks are being considered, it needs to be clear that whatever role they're given, it has to be done within the Sustainable Development Agenda, and making sure that the overall achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals is not compromised, and that we do not leave countries or people behind. I'm very encouraged to see that the scientific community is engaged with other sectors. It's been very inspiring listening to the two addresses before, and to see that this is not the first time we have come to this point. This is not the first time that we've had to ask those questions about how humanity and planet work to make sure that we can thrive. And so I'm sure that with the scientific community and with an inclusive and open conversation, that we will find a pathway through to ensure that by 2030 we achieve these goals, and that we can all be living on a healthy, safe, secure planet. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for that authoritative and inspiring and compelling talk that helped us to put this squarely in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, that helped to remind us of the broad range of global challenges we face, of which climate change is a very special one, and help us to also understand how not only climate change, but of course how climate engineering fits into the context of the Paris Agreement. That's a great start for us for our discussions. And with that, I'd like to give one more round of thanks to all of the speakers for their inspiring, informative, and thought-provoking talks. I'd also like to thank all of those who have contributed to putting this program together. You'll hear more about their names in the morning, and who will contribute to the many sessions this week. And I'd like to wish you all successful as well as highly informative and stimulating critical discussions this week. So we'll close the day with a reception in the foyer and the upper galleries, which should be a great opportunity for you to get started with the critical global discussions at the CEC17.